The Great Hall of the Galactic Consortium stretched for miles in every direction, and within its ancient walls, representatives from 347 alien species had gathered for an emergency session that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. Consul Vethari of the Silith Dominion stood at the central platform, his tall gray body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage as he activated the holographic display before him, showing images that made the assembled delegates gasp in shock and disbelief. 4,000 years ago, we discovered a primitive species on a small blue planet called Earth. Vethari began, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. These creatures called themselves humans, and when we offered them membership in our great consortium, they had the audacity to refuse our generous terms. The delegates murmured among themselves, remembering the ancient history that their ancestors had passed down through generations. We asked only simple things of them, Vethari continued. They would surrender their weapons, limit their expansion to 12 star systems, and allow us to modify their aggressive genetics to make them more peaceful. But they refused every condition we offered. An elderly delegate from the Varix Collective raised one of his 6 arms and spoke in a raspy voice. We remember well, Consul. We erected the quarantine barrier around their space and left them to rot in their little corner of the galaxy. Surely they have learned their lesson by now? Vethari's expression darkened as he manipulated the holographic controls, and new images appeared that caused several delegates to cry out in alarm. That is what I thought as well, honored delegate. But our long-range probes have discovered something impossible, Vethari said. When we sealed them away, humans controlled 12 star systems. Today, they control over 2,000. The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates shouted questions and accusations at one another. How can this be? Demanded the representative from the Kethmari Empire, her scales flashing bright red with anger. Our barrier was supposed to contain them forever. The barrier still stands, Vethari explained, but it appears the humans simply built around it, expanding in directions we never thought to monitor. They have been growing in secret for 4 millennia, and their technology now registers as completely unclassifiable by our sensors in the far corner of the chamber. A small delegation from a minor species called the Talari sat in stunned silence, and among them was a young scientist named Kira, who had spent her entire life studying human history from the few records that remained. She alone among the delegates felt something other than fear. She felt a strange sense of admiration for these stubborn creatures who had refused to bow down to the mightiest civilization in the galaxy. We must act now, Vethari declared, his voice rising with urgency, before these humans grow any stronger. I propose we assemble the largest military force in galactic history and eliminate this threat once and for all. The vote was swift and unanimous, for every species in the consortium feared what humanity might become if left unchecked any longer. Over the following months, 18 million warships gathered from every corner of the galaxy, representing the combined military might of hundreds of civilizations that had conquered countless worlds over millions of years. It was the greatest armada ever assembled, stretching across the void of space like an ocean of metal and fire. And every commander believed that victory would be quick and absolute. Far away, beyond the ancient quarantine barrier, humanity watched the approaching storm with calm eyes and steady hearts. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the UHS Defiance, the flagship of the United Human Systems Navy, and studied the tactical displays showing the enemy's advance. She was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen 3 decades of service, and behind her stood officers from every corner of human space, united in purpose despite the vast distances that separated their homeworlds. Admiral, said her communications officer, a young man named James, we are receiving pledges of support from colony worlds across all 2,000 systems. Even the deep space wanderers are turning homeward. Tanaka nodded slowly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the news. For 4,000 years, humanity had been alone in the universe, cut off from all other intelligent life by a barrier of sentinel stations that the consortium believed would crush the human spirit. Instead, that isolation had forged something incredible. Without alien technology to copy or alien cultures to imitate, humans had been forced to rely on themselves. And they had risen to the challenge in ways that no one could have predicted. They had built colonies on frozen moons and burning asteroids, created artificial worlds that orbited dead stars, and developed technologies that worked on principles the consortium had never discovered. More importantly, they had remembered who they were. Every human child learned the story of the refusal, the day when their ancestors had looked at the most powerful civilization in existence and said no to terms that would have stolen their freedom. That memory had been passed down through generations, becoming a source of pride that bound all humans together, regardless of where they lived or what they believed. "Send a message to all fleet commanders," Tanaka ordered, her voice steady and calm. "Tell them that the enemy is finally coming, and that we will meet them not with fear, but with the same courage that our ancestors showed 4,000 years ago across human space." Billions of people looked up at the stars and prepared for war. Soldiers kissed their families goodbye and boarded transport ships heading for the front lines, while engineers worked around the clock to activate defense systems that had been waiting in silence for centuries. On Earth itself, the birth world of humanity, crowds gathered in the ancient cities to watch the newscasts showing the approaching enemy fleet. There was fear in their hearts, for they knew that defeat would mean extinction. But there was also something stronger than fear. There was determination, passed down through 4,000 years of waiting. There was unity, forged in the fires of isolation. And there was love for the families and homes and futures that they would protect with their very last breath. The Galactic Consortium had declared war on humanity, expecting a quick and easy victory over a primitive species that should have withered and died long ago. They had no idea what was waiting for them beyond the barrier. They had no idea what 4,000 years of patience and preparation had created. And soon, very soon, they would learn the terrible truth about the species they had tried to cage. Humanity was ready. Humanity would stand steadfast. And the galaxy would never be the same again. Marcus Chen was 23 years old when he boarded the military transport that would carry him to war. And as he looked back at the orbital station where his parents stood waving goodbye, he wondered if he would ever see them again. He was not a hero or a legend, just a young man from a mining colony on the edge of human space who had signed up for military service because he believed it was the right thing to do. Around him sat hundreds of other young soldiers, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and determination that Marcus felt in his own heart. "First deployment?" asked the woman sitting next to him, and when Marcus nodded, she smiled kindly and held out her hand. "I am Sergeant Rosa Martinez, and I have been doing this for 15 years. Stick close to me, and you might just survive long enough to become useful." Marcus shook her hand and felt grateful for the small comfort of having someone experienced nearby. The transport ship jumped through space using technology that the consortium had never developed, covering distances in hours that would have taken their enemies weeks to cross. This was one of humanity's greatest advantages. For 4,000 years of independent research had led them down paths of science that no other species had explored. While the consortium shared technology between member species, creating a kind of uniformity in their advancement, humans had been forced to invent everything themselves. The result was a civilization that thought differently, fought differently, and solved problems in ways that no alien mind could predict, far across human space. In a research station hidden in the burning atmosphere of a gas giant, Dr. Amara Asay received an urgent summons from Central Command. She was one of the greatest experts on alien species in all of human space, having spent her entire life studying the scattered records of consortium civilizations that humans had managed to collect over the centuries. "They want me to advise the military," she told her assistant, a young man named David, who looked at her with worried eyes. "They need to know the weaknesses of our enemies." "Do they have weaknesses?" David asked. Amara smiled and began packing her research materials. "Every species has weaknesses, David. The trick is finding them before they find ours." She traveled to the Central Command Station orbiting Earth, where she joined a council of advisors that included scientists, historians, and military strategists from across human space. Admiral Tanaka welcomed her personally and led her to a conference room where holographic displays showed everything humanity knew about the approaching enemy. "The consortium is not as unified as they pretend to be," Amar explained to the assembled officers. "Many of their member species were conquered against their will and forced to join. They serve out of fear, not loyalty. Can we use that against them?" Tanaka asked. "Perhaps," Amara replied. "If we can show these subjugated species that resistance is possible, that the consortium can be defeated, they might rise up against their masters. But first, we must prove that we can win." The officers nodded grimly, knowing that the first battles would determine whether their gamble would succeed or fail. Meanwhile, Fleet Commander Alexander Volkov stood on the bridge of his battleship, the UHS Ironclad, and watched the defensive preparations at the Kepler threshold. He was an old man now, with white hair and a face marked by decades of service. But his eyes were still sharp and his mind still quick. His grandfather had been alive on the day the quarantine barrier went up, and he had told young Alexander stories about the shame and anger that humanity had felt when the galaxy rejected them. "But your great-great-grandmother said something that I have never forgotten," his grandfather had told him. "She said that one day, the galaxy would regret what it had done, and that humanity would be ready when that day came." Volkov had carried those words in his heart for his entire life. "And now the day had finally arrived, Commander," said his tactical officer. "The enemy fleet will reach the Kepler threshold in 6 hours. Our defensive line is ready." "Good," Volkov replied. "Send a message to all ships in the fleet. Tell them that our ancestors are watching, and that we will make them proud." The message spread through the human fleet like wildfire, carried from ship to ship by communications officers who repeated it to their crews. Soldiers checked their weapons one final time. Engineers ran last-minute diagnostics on critical systems, and commanders gathered their officers for final briefings. In the chapel of the UHS Defiance, Admiral Tanaka knelt in silent prayer, asking for the strength to lead her people through the darkness that was coming. She thought about her grandchildren back on Earth, 2 beautiful girls who loved to run through the gardens of their family home and chase butterflies under the warm sun. They were the reason she fought, the reason every human soldier was willing to lay down their life. Not for glory or conquest, but for the simple things that made life worth living. For family and friends, for laughter and love, for the chance to see another sunrise over a world that remained free. The consortium had never understood this about humanity. They saw only a dangerous species that needed to be controlled, a threat that had to be eliminated before it could spread across the galaxy. They never realized that humans did not fight because they wanted to destroy their enemies. They fought because they wanted to protect what they loved. And there was no force in the universe more powerful than that. As the enemy fleet drew closer, 18 million warships strong, the humans of the United Systems checked their weapons and said their prayers and prepared to face impossible odds. They knew that many of them would not survive the coming battle. They knew that the enemy outnumbered them by a factor of hundreds to 1. But they also knew something that the consortium had forgotten in all their millennia of easy conquests. They knew that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stand and fight, even when you were afraid. It was the choice to protect what you loved, even if it cost you everything. And humanity had been making that choice for 4,000 years. The first battle of the war was about to begin, and the galaxy would finally learn what happened when you tried to cage a species that refused to be broken. Marcus Chun gripped his weapon tightly as the transport ship carried him toward the front lines. Somewhere ahead, the enemy was waiting, and humanity was ready to show them what steadfast truly meant. The consortium armada crossed the Kepler threshold at exactly noon by Earth Standard Time. And what happened next would become legend throughout the galaxy. Consul Vethori watched from the bridge of his command ship as his forces advanced toward the human defensive line, feeling confident that victory would be swift and total. His fleet numbered 18 million warships, each one armed with weapons that had conquered 1,000 worlds, crewed by soldiers from species that had never known defeat. The human fleet before them seemed tiny in comparison. A mere 40,000 vessels spread thin across the void of space. "This will be over within the hour," Vethori said to his admirals. "These primitive creatures cannot possibly stand against our might." He gave the order to attack, and the greatest military force in galactic history surged forward with weapons blazing. But something strange happened almost immediately. The human ships did not behave like any enemy the consortium had ever faced. They moved in patterns that seemed random at first, but quickly revealed themselves to be incredibly coordinated, adapting to every consortium attack within seconds. When consortium ships fired their weapons, human vessels were somehow no longer in the expected positions. Having shifted formation in ways that defied standard tactical doctrine, "What are they doing?" demanded Admiral Krath of the Vorix fleet, his 6 eyes widening in confusion as his ships missed target after target. "I do not know," replied his tactical officer. "Their movements make no sense according to our prediction models." But that was the point. Human commanders had spent 4,000 years developing tactics specifically designed to confuse enemies who relied on computer-assisted predictions. They had learned to think in ways that no algorithm could anticipate, combining intuition with calculation in a manner that was uniquely human. And then the humans began firing back. Their weapons were unlike anything the consortium had ever seen. Beams of energy that somehow bypassed shields completely and struck directly at the hulls of enemy vessels. "Impossible," screamed a consortium admiral as his flagship exploded around him. "Our shields are supposed to be impenetrable." But human scientists had discovered principles of physics that the consortium had never explored. Developing weapons that worked on fundamentals the aliens did not even know existed. Within the first hour of battle, 3 million consortium ships had been destroyed. Vethori stared at the tactical display in disbelief, watching as his forces were torn apart by an enemy that should have been easy prey. "Pull back," he ordered. "Regroup and reassess." But even as his fleet retreated, the humans pressed their advantage, pursuing with a ferocity that shocked the consortium commanders. And then something happened that would haunt Vethori for the rest of his life. He intercepted a transmission from a human ship that had been critically damaged. Its hull breached in dozens of places and its engines destroyed. The ship should have been dead. Its crew should have been trying to escape. Instead, the crew was singing. They were singing an ancient human song about home and hope and never giving up, their voices carrying across the void of space as they aimed their dying vessel at a consortium battleship. "What are they doing?" Vethori whispered. His answer came seconds later when the human ship ran directly into the enemy battleship, destroying both vessels in a massive explosion. This was not an isolated incident across the battlefield. Human crews on crippled ships were refusing to surrender. choosing instead to fight until their very last breath. Some used their final moments to shield undamaged Allied vessels, taking hits that would have destroyed their friends. Others transmitted targeting data back to the main fleet, even as enemy fire tore their ships apart. And everywhere, there was that same impossible human spirit. That refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of certain death. "They are insane," Admiral Kraft said, his voice trembling with something that might have been fear. No rational species fights like this, but humanity had never claimed to be rational. They fought with their hearts as much as their minds, driven by love and loyalty and a stubborn determination that had carried them through 4,000 years of isolation. Marcus Chen survived his first battle by following Sergeant Martinez exactly as she had told him to. When she said duck, he ducked. When she said fire, he fired. When she said run, he ran as fast as his legs could carry him. Around him, fellow soldiers fell to enemy fire, and he felt tears streaming down his face, even as he continued fighting. "Keep moving," Martinez shouted, dragging him behind cover as explosions rocked the corridor of the enemy ship they had boarded. More on later. Fight now. She was right, and Marcus forced himself to focus on the present moment. There would be time for grief later if he survived. By the end of the first day of battle, the consortium had lost nearly 3 million ships, while human losses stood at just 47,000. It was a victory beyond anything humanity had dared to hope for. But Admiral Tanaka knew that the war was far from over. "They will adapt," she told her officers. "They will learn from their mistakes and come back stronger. We must be ready." But something had changed in the galaxy. Word of the battle spread quickly, carried by communication signals to every corner of consortium space. Subjugated species who had served the consortium for millennia heard the news and felt something stir in their hearts. Hope for the first time in their history. Someone had proven that the consortium could be beaten. Dr. Amara Osei began broadcasting messages to these oppressed peoples, speaking words that had never been spoken to them before. "You are not alone," she said, her voice carried across light years by powerful transmitters. "Resistance is not futile. Watch what humanity does, and know that freedom is possible." Vatharay listened to these broadcasts and felt cold terror grip his heart. He had expected a quick war against a primitive enemy. Instead, he had awakened something terrible. Something that threatened not just his fleet, but the entire foundation of consortium power. Humanity was not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the freedom of every species the consortium had ever oppressed. And that made them more dangerous than Vethari had ever imagined. The first battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Humanity had drawn first blood, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson they had taught. Some species refused to be conquered. Some species would rather die than submit. And when you push such a species into a corner, you had better be ready for the consequences. The war dragged on for months, and the consortium learned to respect human tenacity even as they continued their relentless advance. Vethari threw wave after wave of ships at the human defenses, winning through sheer numbers what he could not win through superior tactics. Human worlds began to fall, one by one, their populations evacuating just ahead of the enemy advance. But even in defeat, humanity refused to give the consortium an easy victory. Every planet that fell was stripped of useful resources before the enemy arrived. Every station was emptied of critical data. And every loss became a lesson that human commanders refused to waste. "They are like water," complained Admiral Krath during one of the many strategy sessions aboard Vethari's command ship. "Every time we think we have them trapped, they slip through our fingers and appear somewhere else." Vethari nodded grimly, studying the tactical displays that showed his forces slowly pushing toward Earth. He had lost nearly 5 million ships since the war began. a number that would have been unthinkable before his forces had crossed the quarantine barrier. But the humans were losing too, and their smaller population meant that every loss hurt them more than it hurt the consortium. "We will wear them down eventually," Bethari said, though his voice lacked the confidence it once held. Mathematics is on our side, but mathematics did not account for human creativity. Deep in the outer territories of human space, far from the front lines, something incredible was happening. Hidden shipyards that have been built in secret over 2,000 years were finally revealing themselves, emerging from asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres and the dark spaces between stars. These facilities had been constructed by generations of humans who knew that one day the galaxy would come for them. They had worked in secrecy, passing their knowledge from parent to child, building weapons and ships and technologies that were meant for a war that might not come in their lifetimes. And now, that war had finally arrived. Admiral Tanaka received the reports with tears in her eyes, reading the names of shipyards that had been nothing more than legends until this moment. "Operation Prometheus is ready," her aide reported. "Fresh fleets are standing by across all sectors." Tanaka allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine expression of hope she had felt since the war began. "Send the signal," she ordered. "Tell them it is time." Across human space, the hidden fleets began to move. Thousands of ships emerged from concealment, each one more advanced than anything the consortium had ever encountered. These were vessels designed specifically to defeat consortium technology, incorporating lessons learned from centuries of studying the enemy from afar. The consortium commanders watched in shock as fresh human forces appeared on their flanks, cutting supply lines and destroying logistics hubs that they had thought were safely behind the front. "Where are they coming from?" Bethari demanded, staring at his tactical display as red warning lights flashed across sectors that had been secure hours before. No one could answer him. Fleet Commander Volkov led the most daring strike of the entire war, taking his battle group deep into enemy territory to attack the consortium's primary command cluster. He knew that the mission was likely suicide, but he also knew that destroying the enemy's central coordination hub would cripple their ability to respond to the new human offensive. "All ships, this is Commander Volkov," he broadcast to his fleet. "In a few hours, we will strike at the heart of the enemy. Many of us will not survive, but what we do today will echo through history." His crew stood straighter at their stations, pride shining in their eyes despite the fear they all felt. Marcus Chen was aboard one of the ships in Volkov's battle group, having been transferred there after proving himself in the earlier battles of the war. He thought about his parents back on their mining colony, about Sergeant Martinez, who had saved his life so many times, about all the friends he had made and lost since the war began. "No regrets," he whispered to himself, gripping his console. "Whatever happens, no regrets." The attack on the command cluster was chaos and fire and death. Consortium defenders fought with desperate fury, knowing that if this hub fell, their entire war effort would collapse. But the humans fought with something stronger than desperation. They fought with purpose. Volkov's flagship, the U.S. Ironclad, took hit after hit as it pushed through the enemy defenses toward the central station. "Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, his damage control officer reported. "We are losing atmosphere. Keep going," Volkov ordered, his hands steady on the command console. "We are almost there." The ironclad reached the command station just as its engines finally failed. But Volkov had planned for this. "All hands, abandon ship," he ordered, then switched to a fleet-wide broadcast. "To all human forces, this is Commander Alexander Volkov. They wanted to know what humanity is capable of. Show them." He aimed his dying ship at the command station and fired every remaining weapon, the combined explosion destroying both vessels in a blast that lit up the sector. Volkov's last transmission became a rallying cry that spread across human space. "Show them," soldiers repeated as they charged into battle. "Show them," pilots whispered as they engaged overwhelming enemy forces. "Show them," commanders ordered as they led their fleets against impossible odds. And humanity showed them. The destruction of the command hub threw the consortium into chaos. Their coordinated advance falling apart as individual fleets lost contact with central command. At the same time, the subjugated species that Dr. Usay had been speaking to for months finally rose up against their masters. Rebellions erupted across consortium space, drawing forces away from the front lines and spreading chaos throughout the enemy's territory. The tide of war had turned. Vathari watched his empire crumble around him and finally understood the truth that he had been too arrogant to see. Humanity had never been a primitive species that needed to be controlled. They had been a force of nature, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true strength. And now that moment had come. The consortium was falling, and humanity was rising to take its place among the stars. The final battle of the war took place in the skies above Earth, and it was a sight that would be remembered for 10,000 years. Admiral Tanaka had allowed the remnants of the consortium fleet to reach humanity's birth world, not because she was forced to, but because she wanted them to see it. She wanted them to understand what they had been trying to destroy. Earth hung in space like a jewel of blue and green, its oceans sparkling under the light of the sun, its continents covered with forests and cities, and the countless small places where human families made their homes. Around this precious world, every ship and station and satellite that humanity possessed had gathered for the final defense. It was not the largest fleet in terms of numbers, but it was the most determined force the galaxy had ever seen. Consul Vathari stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, the last surviving vessel of his once mighty armada, and stared at the human defensive formation with hollow eyes. His fleet had been reduced from 18 million ships to less than 200,000, and most of those were damaged beyond effective combat capability. The rebellions across consortium space had spread like wildfire, and he had received word just hours ago that the High Council had voted to dissolve the coalition that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. Everything he had known, everything he had believed in, was crumbling around him. "Consul," said his communications officer, "the human flagship is hailing us." Vathari closed his eyes for a moment, gathering what remained of his dignity, then nodded. "Accept the transmission." Admiral Tanaka's face appeared on his view screen, and Vathari was surprised to see not hatred or triumph in her eyes, but something that looked almost like compassion. "Consul Vathari," she said, her voice calm and steady, "your fleet is surrounded and outmatched. Your coalition has collapsed. There is no possibility of victory. I am offering you the chance to surrender and end this war without further bloodshed." Vathari let out a bitter laugh. "Why would you show mercy to an enemy who tried to exterminate your entire species?" Tanaka was quiet for a moment before she replied, and when she spoke, her words would be recorded and studied by historians for centuries to come. "Because that is not who we are," she said simply. "You looked at humanity and saw a threat to be contained. You never understood that we do not fight because we hate our enemies. We fight because we love what is behind us. Our families, our homes, our future." She gestured at the blue planet visible through the viewport of her ship. "You gave us 4,000 years to remember what truly matters, Consul. 4,000 years to become who we were always meant to be. And who we are is not a species that destroys our enemies when they have already been defeated." Vathari felt something crack inside him. Some wall that he had built around his heart over centuries of conquest and domination. "Why?" he whispered, and his voice was no longer the voice of a mighty consul, but of a confused and frightened being who had just watched everything he believed in fall apart. 4,000 years in isolation. You could have grown bitter, turned savage, collapsed into barbarism. Why did you not? Tanaka smiled, and there was warmth in her expression that Vethari had never expected to see from an enemy. Because we had something to fight for, she said. Something worth preserving. You tried to cage us, and instead you gave us time to remember why freedom matters. You tried to break our spirit, and instead you forged us into something unbreakable. She leaned forward, her eyes holding his. Surrender, Consul. Let this war end. And let us show the galaxy that there is another way. The transmission ended. And Vethari sat in silence for a long time. Around him, his crew waited for orders, their faces showing the exhaustion and fear that they had carried for months. Finally, Vethari spoke, and his voice was thick with emotion. Signal the human fleet. Tell them we accept their terms. The war is over. The news spread across the galaxy within hours. The consortium had fallen. Humanity had won. But what happened next surprised everyone, who had expected the humans to take revenge for 4,000 years of isolation and the attempted genocide of their species. Instead of conquering the former consortium worlds, humanity offered partnership. Instead of demanding tribute, they offered trade. Instead of enslaving the defeated species, they offered freedom. We will not become what we fought against, Admiral Tanaka announced in a broadcast that reached every corner of the galaxy. Any species that wishes to join us as equal partners is welcome. Any species that wishes to go its own way is free to do so. We ask only that you respect the freedom of others as we will respect yours. It was an offer that had never been made in galactic history. And it changed everything. 1 year after the war ended, Captain Marcus Chun stood in the docking bay of a human space station. Watching the first consortium refugees arrive, they were Telari, members of a species that had been conquered by the consortium long before humans had even discovered fire. Among them were children, small beings with wide eyes who looked at the human soldiers with obvious fear. Marcus knelt down to their level, making himself less threatening, and smiled the warmest smile he could manage. "Welcome," he said, speaking slowly so the translation devices could work. "Welcome to humanity's space. You are safe here." One of the children, a little girl with silver fur and trembling hands, looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. "You are not going to hurt us?" she asked. Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes as he shook his head. "No, little one. We are not going to hurt you. We are going to help you." He reached out his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, the little girl took it. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. 4,000 years ago, humanity had been offered membership in a galactic civilization, but only if they gave up their freedom. They had refused, and they had been punished for that refusal with isolation and eventually war. But in the end, humanity had proven something that the galaxy had forgotten. True strength was not about domination or conquest. It was about standing up for what you believed in, protecting those you loved, and offering kindness even to those who had once been your enemies. The galaxy had declared war on humanity, thinking they would find easy prey. Instead, they had found a species that stood steadfast. And in standing steadfast, humanity had changed the galaxy forever.